Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Timothy Brook, professor of history at the University of British Columbia and the author of Vermeer's Hat, the 17th Century and the Dawn of the Global World. Tim, welcome to EconTalk.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Your book, Vermeer's Hat, is a fascinating look at globalization in the 1600s, particularly the growing ties between Europe and the rest of the world, and particularly the impact of China on much of the world. It sounds like a very modern story, doesn't it?
It does sound like a modern story, and I think one of the reasons why I wrote this account of the early 17th century in the way I did was to surprise the reader, to get the reader to realize that the globalization of the world, which is the phase we feel we live in now, really goes all the way back, at least to the 17th century. I wanted to get the reader to realize that we're not at this uniquely unusual point of time ourselves, that in fact there is a history, a several centuries history to the globalization we're experiencing today. And I think it goes back to the 1600s. That's when you start to see people and goods and ideas moving around the world in ways that their ancestors had no idea was possible.
Part of the reason for that was the advances in shipbuilding and navigation, I assume.
Yes, that was part of the story. One of the great challenges in sailing on the ocean is not getting lost as soon as you go outside of land. You hug the coast, you're fine. Once you've left the coast, you have to establish latitude and longitude, and longitude was notoriously difficult for mariners until really the end of the 18th century. It was very easy to get lost in the water. So, but with navigation techniques, larger ships that could withstand ocean storms, these are all factors that enabled mostly the Europeans. There were others who were in this maritime navigation story, but mostly the Europeans. It enabled them to lose sight of land and not be lost.
And of course, staying close to land had its own perils.
Yes, it did. Shipwrecks were one of the great common events of the 17th century. In fact, shipwreck tales become an interesting fictional genre in their own right, and we have all the great writers taking this up. Shakespeare writes The Tempest, Defoe writes the story of Gulliver. I mean, you have all of these fiction
Robinson
writers.
Crusoe,
Right.
And I guess part of it was also competition among the great seafaring nations that were vying for influence and wealth.
Yes, I think this is probably true. I never quite know what to do with the issue of competition. Certainly, it drove some of or it imparted some of the dynamism to what Europeans in the 17th century were doing, because the international maritime trade had started with the Spanish and the Portuguese through the 16th century in competition with each other. By the end of that century, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns have been united. The competition is still there, but it's dulled down. But what really gets the trade moving in the 17th century is when other European nations, particularly England, the Netherlands, France, when these countries start trying to fight their way into the trade, this seems to lend a particular impetus to their trading and exploration exploits.
In the book, you use the paintings of the great Dutch painter Vermeer as a jumping-off point for understanding the pace of change in the 17th century, and it's a bit of a challenge in a podcast to talk about the paintings, but some of them are available up on the web. They're beautifully reproduced in the book. But let's talk about a few of those.
All right.
You open with the view of Delft. View from Delft or view of Delft?
View of Delft.
View of Delft.
It's Vermeer's one significant landscape painting, and he may have done more, but it's the only one that survives. It's a beautiful painting of the southwestern corner of the city at the moat which surrounded the old city of Delft in the Netherlands. And it's a scene that Well, at first glance, it's just a bucolic Dutch landscape, and you don't think much. Well,
Well, I wouldn't think much of
no,
it.
no.
Just to look
one
at
look at it just thinks, oh, this lovely town, and
Yep.
there's water in front, and beautiful skies, and those big
Nice
white
spires.
clouds that blow it off the North Sea. But I got intrigued with this painting because I thought, well, I asked myself, why did Vermeer paint this particular part of Delft? He could have painted Delft from any number of angles, and in fact, there had Delft really grew up in the 16th century as a major city, and there were standard artistic vistas that painters took. But I was curious why I chose this one, and so I started doing some research, and I realized that the water we're looking at is actually the harbor, the city's harbor, that connects it by waterway down to Rotterdam and eventually out to the North Sea and to the world. So I realized, first of all, that the water is a harbor. I started looking at the boats in the harbor to try and figure out what they were doing there and why they were there. And then I started looking at the buildings, and I'm sorry we don't have visuals for the podcast, but we have a skyline, and we've got a couple of church steeples, and those are recognizably the old and new church in Delft. But there's a large set of buildings that fill the left-hand side of the page, and I realized that these were the offices and warehouses of the Dutch East India Company. This was it was a novel institution that the Dutch state created in 1602 to trade to Asia. Through the 1590s and the turn of the century, Dutch merchants were starting to set up their own little trading companies, competing against each other, and the competition, rather than driving business up, was driving business down. There were not enough goods in circulation for all these merchants to be competing with each other. So the Dutch government stepped in and said, right, you guys form a corporation. And they forced all the merchants trading to China into this corporation. It was a brilliant move because the corporation then takes off. It's the beginning of the joint stock corporation that we know today. So what struck me about this painting, the view of Delft, was that, in fact, it's a portrait of the offices of the Dutch East India Company and Delft's trading links to the world.
Now, I think you mentioned in that discussion that the Dutch government also took a little piece of that action as a result of that.
Yes. This
incorporation.
The formation of the Dutch East India Company facilitated the concentration of capital. It facilitated shipbuilding, and the state was very much involved in this story. Once the corporation was running, the state didn't particularly interest itself, other than, of course, taking a nice heavy cut in taxes. But that, in a way, helps to finance the rise of the Netherlands in the 17th century. The Netherlands is an important trading nation in that period. It's also the first, I think it's fair to say, it's the first real republic. It's the old order was overthrown. The new merchant interests took control of the government and built the Netherlands up. This was the golden age for the Dutch.
I'm just wondering if perhaps their interest in the government's interest in forcing those merchants together had another motive besides helping them be more successful. But that's another story. Talk about the herring buses in the picture, because that was a fascinating example of economic change stimulated by climate change, and also leading to some economic effects that were, in this particular case, rather helpful to the Dutch.
Yes, this was a nice surprise to me. If you look at the painting, which you can't, there are two large, heavily built boats that are moored on the right-hand side of the harbor. Their masts have been struck. They're at the Delft shipyard. They're being refitted. I was in The Hague, which is where the painting hangs, and when I was able to see the painting in real life, and it's much larger than I realized. Most Vermeer paintings, when you see them, you're shocked by how small they are, or I am.
Give me a rough idea. Because many of them are interior scenes by an open or closed window.
Right, and those paintings are sometimes only about a foot or a little bit more wide.
Wow.
The view of Delft, oh dear, I'm going to guess here it's about 4 or 5 feet wide. It's quite a large
totally
painting.
Different, yeah.
It was surprising. So you could, and you can always see detail much better in real life. No reproduction can do these paintings justice. Anyway, I digress. When I looked at the painting, I saw these large boats and wondered what they were, and was able to determine that these are called herring busses. These are boats that were used for the herring fishery in the North Sea. Now, one of the factors having to do with which economic historians cite for the rise of the Netherlands is climate change. The late 16th and 17th centuries were a much colder period. This was a period of global cooling. One of the things the global cooling did was force the herring stocks, which were normally up the Norwegian coast. It forced the herring south. So the herring come down much closer to the Netherlands, and Dutch fishermen are able to go out in the North Sea and reap a huge herring harvest through the late 16th, early 17th centuries. This is a kind of windfall that gives them wealth that they would otherwise have not been able to control. So what I explain in the book is that the rise of the Netherlands is in part tied to climate change, and these herring busses in the View of Delft are the sign in this painting of the changes that are happening. And I have to say I enjoy doing this. I enjoy looking at a painting and saying, all right, what has the artist included, and why might those things be in that painting? This is not what art historians do. I suppose it's what historians do, but it's very much part of trying to understand the world that Vermeer lived in and the world he was trying to paint. Now, it would have been perfect from my point of view if Vermeer had painted a winter scene, and then I could have waxed eloquent about the colder winters and the way in which this affected the European economy. Alas, he never did that. He only seems to paint spring, summer, and fall scenes. But we do know that the winters were cold when he was a young man with a family, and there are very few records about Vermeer. He didn't leave any diaries or letters or account books or anything like that. But we do have some scraps, and one of the scraps says that he bought an ice boat in 1660. And an ice boat was something that the Dutch used to get around in winter. It was a kind of a sled with a sail, and you could go sailing along the frozen canals. Now, you couldn't do this in the 16th century, and you certainly can't do it today. The canals don't freeze. But in those days of global cooling, they did. So this is the world that he's a part of, and perhaps we think of winter as a time in which the traditional economy would slow down. There wouldn't be the same rate of trade. The crops aren't growing. But cold does other things. It moves people around. It forces people into other activities. And this is part of the story that I tell in the book.
Well, we've talked in other podcasts about the sometimes negative impact of natural resources on an economy.
Yeah.
It's sometimes called a curse. And yet here's an example where a windfall, as you describe it, benefited the Netherlands. I think the distinction I'd make for our listeners is that this one was decentralized. It was spread out among a whole bunch of fishermen, and it wasn't controlled by an autocratic government, which is the recipe for disaster in most modern stories where nations have natural resources and then it's a prize that the autocracy gets to milk. Mm-hmm. So in this case, it was spread out among a bunch of fishermen.
Yeah, and the Dutch were very conscious of the fact that they weren't an autocratic state. The Dutch had been in the 16th century. The Dutch were under the control of the Spanish monarchy, and this was a source of great frustration for them. And the Dutch state emerges in the late 16th century in a struggle against Spain, because Spain had managed to weave a great empire through much of southern and western Europe. And so the Dutch were a very independent group. Fishermen are notoriously independent. And then the merchants who first were handling the fish and were handling other kinds of goods as well were also fiercely independent. And they were scattered in a dozen ports along the Dutch coast. And it's these people that the Dutch government, in this case, I think wisely said, let's start working together rather than compete against each other. We're a small nation. Let's compete against the great states of Europe, and they were able to do so successfully.
You mentioned earlier that you were digressing. I should say that EconTalk we thrive on digression here, and I'm going to make a brief digression here about Vermeer before we move on to some other aspects of international trade. First, I want to say that as a latecomer to the world of art, your book gives me a very, I think, a wonderful way to look at paintings, because it reminds you that what the artist includes isn't what the artist stumbles on. It's what the artist has chosen to put in the foreground or the background. And you do a wonderful job talking about those artifacts and wall hangings and other things, and I really enjoyed that. The second thing I learned that I thought was quite interesting, which is always a useful reminder, is how hard life was until fairly recently. And you mentioned that poor Mrs. Vermeer, I think, had 16 pregnancies. Is that correct?
Yes.
That we know of.
Yes.
And buried 5 children.
Yes.
And that poor Vermeer himself died young, and when they went to bury him, found the last child they had buried there still there, mostly intact.
Yeah.
Buried him on top. Buried the child on top of the father. Very sad.
Yes, we this is something that I like to stress in the book, or just to remind readers that life was not as easy as we have it now. We think of Vermeer as a stunningly successful artist, and the paintings that he did are inexpressibly beautiful, and we somehow, perhaps unthinkingly, might see in those scenes that he's painted this kind of perfect golden world. Well, it was a very hard world. He spent a lot of his time trying to make money unsuccessfully. He was largely supported by his mother-in-law, who was a very successful businesswoman in Delft. His fortunes rose and fell according to all manner of things. Whether when the Netherlands was at war, that tended to kill the art market, and so he was also an art dealer as well as an artist. I think he was also having trouble in his 40s finding the same artistic inspiration that he'd had as a young man. And so when he dies of not a pauper, because his mother-in-law had bought a grave in the old church so that when he died there was a place to be buried. But the family was bankrupt. Catharina Bones, his wife, had to declare bankruptcy 3 months after he died. And for a historian, this was a wonderful a gift to us. It was not a happy thing for the Vermeer family, but for the historian, it's great, because when he died, Catharina had to draw up a list of all his possessions.
Yeah.
And it's from this list that we can begin to reconstruct something of his life. What did he own? What clothes did he own? What paintings did he own? Who was he in debt to? All of this information is preserved in the archives in Delft. And it's oddly enough, it's from the man's beautiful paintings, and then from the documents of a rather, I won't say it's a tragic life, but it was a difficult life. And from those documents at the end of his life, we try and triangulate from these 2 points to try and understand something about the man himself. And the man himself is very elusive. There have been many attempts to capture him, but they all have to talk around Vermeer. There's not much we can say about him. We suspect we know what he looks like because he painted himself into an early picture. After that, we know nothing about the man.
Well, he sure was into light.
Yes.
Bless him.
Yes, and I think really you almost have to be in the Netherlands to catch this sense of the light that comes in. It's quite extraordinary. I suppose it's because of the sea air. There's this constant wind coming in off the North Sea, and if any of the listeners have been in the Netherlands, probably one of the sharpest visual memories they'll have of being there are these fluffy white clouds, often dumping rain at the same time, but these huge cumulus clouds that are blowing in across the landscape, and it creates this dappled light effect. And no one captures this like Vermeer.
Well, let's talk now about some of the trade issues that are in the rest of the book. You start off... it's on the cover of the book, and it's a key chapter early on, the officer and the laughing girl.
Yes.
It's we see an officer mostly from behind. You see a little bit of his face. The main focus is the light on the face of the laughing girl. But the man's wearing an enormous hat, and you use that as a for the title of the book, obviously, Vermeer's hat. And you also use it to talk about trade between Europe and North America. So talk about what that hat is probably made of and why it was so important.
Well, let me step back a bit from your question. I'll take a detour to get to it. This picture, the reason why it ended up on the front of the book is happenstance. It has to do with lecturing. I was putting together a course for first-year students in world history. Now, world history is an awfully difficult thing to give first-year students because there's so much of the world there, and so I wanted to focus on certain places and times. But I started out the course by showing them a series of Dutch paintings from the 17th century that had maps hanging on the wall. And if you were to pick up a volume of 17th century Dutch art and look at the interiors, many of them have maps hanging there. And I started the course by saying, let's look at what interested 17th century artists, and not from an artistic point of view, but see what they put in the rooms. And they put maps in the room. And so then I asked the students, well, why are maps there? And the maps are there because people are interested in the world. They want to know something about the place beyond themselves. Now, there's a map on the wall of Officer and Laughing Girl. It's a map of the Netherlands. That map was a patriotic production designed to give Dutch people a sense of a view of this newly emerged country that has come out of Spanish occupation. They're very proud of this. But many of the other maps on the wall also show Europe. There are maps of the world. We see this, what seems to be great interest on the part of Dutch householders of hanging maps on the wall. Well, I had this up on the screen showing my students, and then I remember the lecture this was happening in. The slide was up on the wall, and I suddenly noticed the hat. Now, the hat is an odd thing in this painting. It's very dark. You basically just see it in outline. There's a little some decoration in the man's hat band, but you don't really see the hat, but it really looms. It's this large black object sitting in the middle of the painting. Now, as a Canadian, I was brought up on tales of the fur trade. This is part of the Canadian school curriculum. The growth of Canada has to do with the spread of the fur trade up the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes. And so I suddenly thought, that hat is made of beaver fur. And I suddenly saw this link that could take me from Northern Europe, from the Netherlands, over to North America. So I started to pursue this. Now, these huge hats that Dutch gentlemen wore are made from beaver fur, but they're not made from the fur itself. The fur, the main hairs, the long hairs on the fur are actually stripped off, and what are wanted is the under fur, which is barbed. And once you cook this and beat it into felt, you have the best felt in the world. It's marvelous for keeping off the rain. It can be blocked into shapes. It has a dark, lustrous color. This was what Europeans in the 16th century were lusting after. They wanted beaver fur to make these hats. And so hats through the early 17th century get larger and larger and larger. You can see this in European paintings of the period. People love these hats. So this then got me interested in the trade between North America and Northern Europe. The fur trade is largely controlled by the French because the French have gone up the St. Lawrence. They're the ones who are trading for the beaver furs. But then that led me to a further question, which is, why were they there in the first place? Why were they trading for furs? Now, you could simplify this story and say, well, there is this fashion that led Europeans to want to trade for beaver fur. But the fashion really is the outcome of the trade. It's not the cause of the trade. The French were going up the St. Lawrence looking for something. They weren't actually looking for beaver fur. Beaver fur, in a sense, fell into their hands. It's what native communities were willing to sell them. It was a very popular commodity. The French were buying it up, the Dutch and the English as well. But the French were there for another purpose. And so I wanted to think about what that purpose was. And to sort that out, I went back to the original commission that Samuel Champlain, the head of the French expedition, what was his original commission from Henry IV, his king? And the original commission was to find a route to China. The entire French enterprise in the Great Lakes was to find this route. We call it the Northwest Passage, going up around the northern part of North America, but in the early 17th century, people were hoping there was a water route across North America. So the French go up the St. Lawrence, they go up through the Great Lakes, they are looking for a route to China. And the beaver fur is simply there to help them cover their costs on their way to China.
It's such an incredible story, and one of the things I like about it is the unawareness people had of the size of the Earth. They started to realize it was round, but they didn't realize quite how far around it was.
Yes, and the Americas were a bit of a surprise to everyone.
Yeah.
One of these sort of public school truths about Columbus is that he sailed off and he was afraid he was going to sail off the edge of the world. I don't know where that came from, but it's utter nonsense. Columbus had a very clear idea that the world was round, and he had a very clear idea that if he sailed west long enough, he would get to Asia. What he didn't know is that the Americas would suddenly loom in his way. So when Columbus gets to the Caribbean, he thought he's got to Japan.
Yep.
And he's sure that, from Japan, then all he has to do is go around Cuba, and on the other side of Cuba, he will find China. But it wasn't Japan, and of course, that wasn't China. It was the Americas. So initially, there's this puzzle about how far you have to go heading west, and then the puzzle is how wide is the continent. Now, when the Spanish are in Central America, they're at the narrowest part of the continent. They get across the Isthmus of Panama without too much difficulty.
But they've still got a long way to go.
Oh yes, a long way to go. Because in some ways, water is worse than land, because out on the water, when the storm comes, you've got no place to hide. But in other ways, the land is worse than the water, because water you can get across without expending too much energy.
There's too much friction on land.
In
those days.
More friction.
In those days.
And the other thing is that there are people, and the people are not always going to be terribly keen about having you tromping across their territory. So when Champlain comes into the eastern woodlands of North America, he's dealing with, he's not simply an explorer coming into Terras Nullius. He's coming into a region that is populated, that has established sovereignty arrangements, that has trade arrangements. And Champlain's challenge is to figure out, how can I insert myself into the trading patterns that are going on? It wasn't how can I bring my goods and set up trade. It was, how can I become part of the trading patterns that are there? So he finds allies, as you have to when you're coming into a new zone. First with the Montagnais, then with the Algonquins, then with the Huron, and to some extent is playing these tribal groups off against each other in order to try and advance his own cause. In his own cause, he's happy to trade. He brings trade goods from Europe. He exchanges them for beaver pelts.
What is he exchanging for those pelts? I've forgotten. What are the Indians getting in return?
The natives want metal goods because they don't have the technology they don't have metallurgy. So they're interested in axe heads. They're interested in pots, and then by the second decade of the 17th century, what they really want is guns, because this is the thing that the Europeans bring. The Europeans bring a weapon that is more lethal than anything that the natives have. They have bow and arrows and use them very well, but a gun is a whole other order of magnitude of violence, and this becomes the thing that natives want. Initially, the French are very careful about selling arms to their native allies. Initially, they refuse to do it, but then as competition with trade heats up, they realize they're going to have to start selling arms. The Dutch are up the Hudson River. They're in New York State at this point. The Dutch are quite indiscriminate. They'll sell arms to anyone in order to get the furs that they want. But this has a terrible effect in several ways. First of all, the arms they trade are then sold on to other groups. These arms are then used not just against Europeans; they are used against each other. And so the native groups in the eastern woodlands were engaged in a kind of a sort of balancing act with each other. Violence determined where the borders of their territories lay, and there was a kind of constant recalibrating of these borders. But once you introduce guns, the violence that could erupt among tribes became vicious, it became deadly. And so we have the Europeans to thank for many unfortunate things that happened to First Nations people in North America. One is the introduction of guns. The other that comes with the guns is epidemic diseases. And so the tribes in the eastern woodlands are decimated by measles and smallpox as well as by guns. Now, this certainly wasn't what Champlain intended when he arrived, but the understanding of epidemic diseases at that point is very rudimentary. The understanding of guns was much better. But
how important does the beaver trade become?
The beaver trade is extremely important through the 17th and 18th centuries. It's not...
Are we just talking hats here? Or are they doing other things?
Principally hats, felt. Felt is used for other kinds of adornment, clothing. This is the commodity that is readily available. Now, the French are also hoping to find mineral deposits. Copper is the one mineral that natives are trading and that the French are buying. Wood is not yet a significant commodity, although it becomes so by the 18th century. And this is a story for the British when we move forward into the 18th century. The British are building their navy, and for these ships you need a lot of wood. And so North America is a wood windfall.
It's a big forest
for the Europeans. The forests, yes, provide the kind of wood they need, that all the European nations need in order to build their ships. The wood is also an energy windfall for the Europeans because wood is what they were burning for energy. So there is this energy windfall that comes to the Europeans, and then once they start colonizing, then there are certain crops that get introduced. Basically, export commodity crops like tobacco and sugar. These are the two most important commercial crops that develop in North America in the 17th century. That become part then of an exchange of goods that is going in all directions. You've got sugar coming from the Caribbean to Europe. You have tobacco coming from North America. You have many other commodities are entering this trade. Most notoriously, slaves from Africa become part of the way in which Europe becomes wealthy by trading in these goods around the Atlantic Ocean.
Well, let's move on to China, which is a extremely really fascinating cultural and economic story that runs through the book. In Vermeer's painting, Young Woman Reading a Letter at an Open Window, there's a plate of fruit in the foreground, and the plate, or it's actually a bowl, I think, is Chinese porcelain.
Yes.
What's it doing there? And what's it doing in the Netherlands in the middle of the 17th century?
Well, this again is why I find Vermeer such a great artist to work from. Just like the herring buses in view of Delft that are telling us something about global cooling, we've got this porcelain dish in the foreground of Woman Reading a Letter at an Open Window. You hardly see the plate. In fact, it's kind of tilted sideways. It's pushed up against a Turkish carpet. There's fruit in the bowl, but it just peeks. The rim of this bowl just peeks up behind the carpet. Very subtly done, but as a China historian, my interest
grabbed your eye.
Yes, this is what catches my attention. Now, it would also have caught a viewer's attention in the 17th century because Chinese porcelains were just becoming widely available at the time that Vermeer was painting. And he and every other Dutch artist of that period they were all putting Chinese porcelain into their paintings. These were lovely things. They were just beautiful. They were wonderful for an artist to paint because they had a luster. The glaze on Chinese porcelain was far superior to anything that a European potter could produce. So the artists loved to paint these things. And I think the people who bought the paintings also liked to see them in it. These were the new luxury goods. People wanted to display them. They have them around their house. They put them on sideboards. They put them on mantelpieces, on the lintels over their doors. They put this stuff.
People still do.
Yes, and people still
Asian
do.
art
Yes,
is
it's still a decorative item.
and
It's a very good point. We like to see these things. There's a sense of beauty to them that is wonderful. Well, this is also a 17th century story. The first major shipment of porcelain comes from a Portuguese ship that the Dutch capture in 1602. And they capture the ship, they bring it back to Amsterdam, they unload it, and it's full of porcelain. Now, the Portuguese have been bringing a modest amount of porcelain into Europe in the 16th century, but the porcelain was largely not leaving Portugal and Spain. It was just staying there. Much of it, in fact, ended up in Mexico. So Northern Europeans don't have much access to the market. They capture this ship, unload the porcelain cargo, and there is a wild sale that goes on in Amsterdam. The crowned heads of Europe all send buyers to Amsterdam to buy some of this stuff. It's so wonderful. The Dutch do this again 2 years later, capture another Portuguese ship, bring that up. These ships are called carracks, and so the Dutch call this carrack porcelain or crack porcelain. And the second ship, the reaction of the second ship is just the same. Huge excitement over this amazing porcelain that comes out of the ship. So after that, by 1608, the Dutch East India Company is telling its buyers in Asia, buy porcelain, bring as much of this stuff back as you possibly can, and so they start doing that. Now, initially, the porcelain is very expensive. Ordinary people cannot buy it. It's really only for wealthy people. But gradually, as we move to the middle of the 17th century, the volume of porcelain imports has gone up to such an extent that somebody like Vermeer, who's I'm not sure how to quite characterize him, but a sort of lesser middle-class family, is able to own a couple of pieces. So if you look through all of Vermeer's paintings, you see them here and there. I've spotted 4 so far. He's got this sort of shallow dish in the painting that you mentioned. He uses this in another painting, a wonderful one of a young woman who's fallen asleep at a table, and there's one of these dishes in the. It's probably the same dish on the table in front of her. There's a couple of other. There's a beautiful dark blue ginger jar that appears in one painting. There's also a bowl with high sides that appears in another one. So the family may have owned 4 or 5 pieces of Chinese porcelain, and Vermeer made a point of sticking them around his paintings. They were lovely decorative objects. But sorry to go on about this, but there's one other thing that they do, and that is they convey a sense of good taste and gentility in these paintings, that fine families would own porcelain. Therefore, the way you communicate that to the viewer is you make sure that there's a piece of porcelain in the picture. It shows that the family is well off and that it's a family of good taste.
Well, one of the things it conveys to us almost 400 years later is an openness to other cultures and other people.
Exactly.
That as I mentioned earlier, it's not my taste, but people do still collect Chinese art of various kinds as a way of either expressing beauty or style or just the exotic. And Europe and America has always, not always, but often is open to those cultural imports. But
yes,
it didn't go very far in the other direction. And that's what I want you to talk about. Talk about what the Chinese perception was. So the Europeans are mad for this porcelain, and you mentioned that millions of pieces come in over the decades. Much of it probably breaking on the way, others breaking once it got there and being replaced. It's a wonderful product, but it's a bit fragile. So you had this importing of and it affected, as you point out, it affected Dutch art. It affected Dutch porcelain, Delftware, in terms of color, the use of color, and attempts to equal the quality of the glazing. And yet, the influence of Europe on or America on China was much smaller.
Yes,
in those
seems
days.
Imbalanced.
Why? What was going on in China that made that trade so one way in terms of influence?
It's difficult to give you a single why, but I think your second question, what was going on in China, is the question we need to ask to try and figure this out. There are many stereotypes about China, but one of the stereotypes is that Europeans are curious about the outside world, seek to engage with the outside world, are constantly revising their views based on their experience in the outside world. On the other side of this assumption is that China is a place that...
And Japan.
Yes, well, much of Asia. These were places that were inward-looking, that were closed to the outside world, that resisted foreign influence. This, like all stereotypes, it's got elements of truth and elements of error, I think. And I think what you have to do is you have to go back to the 17th century and see how the Europe-China relationship was beginning to build. China... to be fair, China was a large part of the world that had an adequate resource base for most of its needs, that had an advanced technology, and was not having to look outside of itself for things that it needed. Europe is a continent divided amongst a number of small countries, none of which has the resources adequate for its own success. European nations have got to trade, they've got to compete. It's a different way of thinking about how to survive as a state. It's a different way of thinking about the economy. China in the 17th century, China for the last 2 millennia, has largely been a large unified landmass with an adequate resource base. A great deal of trade. China is a very commercial place in the 17th century, but it was commerce that was internal to the country. It was not foreign trade. Now, that's something of a stereotype, but I think we can start to ask some questions about that. And first of all, did the Chinese travel abroad to trade? And the answer is absolutely yes. Now, the Chinese government was rather hostile to this, not uniformly. There are times when the Chinese border is open and Chinese merchants are allowed to trade and they are allowed to import goods from abroad. But there are other times in the 16th and 17th centuries when the borders are closed. Now, the Chinese government tended to close its borders when it perceived a security threat. So the issue was never trade per se. It was whether the people involved in the trade were going to be threatening to Chinese authority or whether they were going to be threatening to Chinese people. So for long stretches of the 16th century, it is absolutely illegal to sail abroad. In fact, there's a law is put in the 1520s saying that no ship of 2 masts or more is able to put out to sea, which is a way of saying you can hug the coast and that's it. You cannot engage in trade. Now, this law is lifted in the 1570s, and so by the time the Dutch arrive, the Dutch do most of their trading, in fact, outside China. They're in Sumatra, Java, Borneo. They're in Southeast Asia, and they trade with Chinese there. So Chinese merchants bring their goods out to Southeast Asia. This is where the Dutch trade. The Dutch also come up along the coast. They try and get a trading post in somewhere along the coast. The Chinese government is hostile, and we often speak of this in terms of xenophobia or as an unwillingness to be open to the West. The Chinese didn't see it that way. The Chinese view is, or the view of the Chinese government is that China is a sovereign territory. if foreigners want to come, they have to trade according to Chinese laws. They can't simply sort of land, build themselves a trading post, and say, right, we're here to trade. This was a bit of a shock to the Europeans, because Europeans were going to the Americas, going to Africa, and setting up bases there. Well, that's fine. Well, it wasn't fine for native peoples around the world, but at the time, the Europeans were able to do this because there were no states that said, sorry, we have sovereignty here. You can't just come and set up a colony and start trading. And so this was the Chinese message to the Europeans. Now, the Portuguese managed to get a little colony on a peninsula at the south end of China, Macau, and but that was the only place that Europeans were actually allowed to live permanently. There was a trading season. There was a fair at Canton every year. They could come to the trade fair. They could trade, but they could not set up a colony. Now, I don't think this is so much that China wishes to close itself off to the outside world, but it wants to control its terms of trade and the terms of its diplomatic relations with the outside world.
But the result, one of the results, which you mentioned in passing, which I thought was so fascinating, incredible story really, is the evolution of European world maps and Chinese world maps. So the European, there's the Vermeer painting that is the geographer who's got the globe on the top of his on a shelf or atop of a dresser, whatever it is. But this globe, you point out, in real life, the actual globe that he's reproducing there, in real life had an apology on it. It's a bit awkward when you put out a globe a few years after another edition, and it's real different because you sold the other globe, the earlier one, as a replica of the world, and now you're saying, well, actually, it wasn't a replica of the world; it was off. Yes. And that must have been happening constantly with maps and globes. But in the case of China, that evolution was not happening. So explain why.
Yes, well, you're right to point out this difference. It was a difference of effects. The effect of Europeans being out around the world, trading, going to new places, exploring new markets. The knowledge effect on this was huge. And one of the easiest ways we can track the effect of this new knowledge is to look at maps and globes. You're absolutely right. The globe that's in the Vermeer painting, the geographer, has a little note on it. The real one has a note on it saying, sorry, the world keeps changing. And it also says, and anyone who comes back from some place that we haven't managed to put on the globe right, please write to us and we'll change the map. So maps are constantly changing, and knowledge of the world is constantly changing. And this becomes a tremendous resource for Europeans. It improves their ability to travel around the world and to engage in the trade that is booming in the 17th century. The Chinese are in a very different position. The effect of maintaining their border security and of limiting foreign trade means that they don't have this flood of new knowledge coming to China. They don't know really what the shape of the world is. They don't know what's going on out there. And so they find themselves at a disadvantage. Now, it's not much of a disadvantage in the 17th century. True, Chinese firearms are somewhat superior to, are inferior to European firearms. European ships are larger and more defensible than Chinese ships. So there are differences in the 17th century. They're not huge. Where the difference really comes in is at the end of the 18th century, the early 19th century. This is when European ship technology and munitions technology escalates to a level far beyond anything a nation like China can put out on the water to defend itself. And this is when the world order, as we knew it in the 17th, 18th century, starts to collapse, and the new order, the new imperialist order coming from Europe, takes control of the globe. And China is not prepared. China is not able to respond effectively.
Well, you quote Francis Bacon, marveling at the compass, paper, and gunpowder, famously unaware, you point out,
yes,
that all three innovations, all three technologies came from China.
Yes.
And China which had been a great innovator, quote, falls behind and can't even steal the innovations of others if it doesn't go out and explore it. Do you think it's true that in those centuries that followed, that they paid a price, and not just in terms of munitions and ships, but in other areas that they once were so superb at?
Yes, they did pay a price, and I think we have to be careful about looking back from the present to understand the judgments and decisions that get made in the past. I mean, the only place we can stand in the present, we can only look back. We can't go back to stand in 1600 and look forward and see what's happening. We can only stand in 2008 and look back. But we have to be careful about the assumptions that we bring into this. It's not clear that a turning point is reached until really, I think, quite late, until the 18th and 19th centuries. But the price that the Chinese end up paying, well, it's ignorance of the outside world. It's a delayed reception of technological advances. And I should say, in terms of technology, as you point out, China was a great source of technological innovation. And that innovation, if you like, was a sort of steady upward slope of new developments. Well, Europe, after the Renaissance, starts going through a technological transformation that causes that slope to become suddenly very much steeper, and the Chinese are not able to follow. And so when they have to learn industrialization in the 19th century, sort of at the point of a gun, rather than as the kind of slow process that characterized their own technical innovation before that. So it leaves China unprepared to deal with the outside world. It leaves Chinese without the linguistic capabilities to be able to go out into the world. And one of the marvelous things I discovered in the 17th century is the extent to which Europeans were picking up languages. And it's not the captains and the commanders who are picking up these languages. It's very ordinary people. One of the things I try and do in the book is to show how all of this affected ordinary people: the sailors, soldiers, people working as to handle goods. These are the people who are actually going out into the world, learning foreign languages, learning about the outside world, bringing their experiences back, and making Europe the cosmopolitan place that it certainly wasn't in the 15th and 16th centuries. Europe was a much more closed society. So the effect of of people going out into the world in the 17th century is to transform Europe in a way that China is not transformed. And
it was a marvelous time in many dimensions. You had on the downside a lot of plague and some of the problems of economic change that you talk about, but it was a time of great opportunity and dynamism.
Yes, well, the textbooks will call this the age of discovery, I suppose. And I prefer to think of it as the age of innovation. This is when people were having to come up with new ways of sorting out their lives, new ways of dealing with the world, because they suddenly found they were living in a much larger place, a much more complex place than they had ever understood. They were interacting with people of different languages, customs, religions, and Europeans had constantly to improvise in order to make sense of this. And I have to say, to some extent, Chinese did too. It was a very innovative age for them. One element of the Chinese story, I don't really address this in the book, but the story in China changes because China is invaded in 1644 by the Manchus, who are an inter-Asian people living up in Siberia. And they come down, enter China in 1644, and then control it to 1911. That, I think, has a dampening effect. China, had it remained under the Ming Dynasty, the Ming was not hugely welcoming to foreigners, but it was willing to develop certain accommodations with the foreigners. This sense of willingness to accommodate is lost after the Manchus invade. Now, the Manchus themselves begin to reopen the process in the 1680s. But the transformations that may have been underway in China are dampened down by the political context.
There's an inevitable comparison to today's world that I think some commenters and pundits use for their own, axe grinding about the turmoil of this age. But there's something equally marvelous and extraordinary about our opportunity to sample and taste and listen to foreign culture now in a way. Foreign's not the foreign meaning from wherever you live. The opportunity to access the way other people look and think and cook and make music and speak is just so extraordinary. And for many of us, it's the best time to be alive because of all that spread of
I agree
knowledge
with you,
around
and
the
I
world.
think that's why I wrote the book the way in which I did. We live in an incomparable time. We live in a time of terrible difficulties and problems, but we live in a time in which we can live all around the world and experience the world in ways that we value and see as part of what makes us who we are. And to tell that story, I think the 17th century is the point where you have to go back. This is the beginning of a kind of openness to the world that transforms us. And so I wanted the reader to be able to see that what we enjoy today, what is possible today, rests on many centuries, and that it's not something that we somehow have discovered in the last couple of decades. It's why I use the phrase "the dawn of the global world" in my subtitle. I see this as the 17th century as the place in which this transformation is starting to occur, in which people are starting to see the new possibilities of living differently and interacting in intercultural ways that they couldn't have conceived of in the 16th century. So we're very much part of a world that's existed for several centuries. We're not something that has suddenly appeared today.
We're almost out of time. I'd like you to close with a question answering a question that I know you need 4 or 5 hours or maybe a semester, but the book made me think about China today and how different China today is with its opening of its shores and its people to incredible amounts of foreign investment that would have been unimaginable certainly a few hundred years ago, but even 30 years ago. So there's an enormous influx of Western money, Western people, Western ideas, Western culture. The Chinese government tries to limit it to some extent.
Yes.
They have an internet. They cripple it in creative ways, but it's still there. And there are right now listeners to EconTalk in China who've emailed me, and I find that to be an ever wondrous thing.
Yes.
Could you speculate? Could you speculate for a minute about what role, if any, China's past has on its attitudes today with respect to the influence of trade and foreign culture?
The past is very much present today in China, and it's present in this sense of being anxiety about what opening up to the outside world is going to do. And in part, this anxiety, though, I think has more to do with the 19th century, which was a terrible century for China. You had the British forcing China to buy opium, you had civil war, you had border skirmishes all over the Chinese borders. The 19th century was a terrible century, and the legacy of that managed to survive through much of the 20th century as well. So Chinese in 2008 are coming out of a 2-century-long crisis that makes them very cautious. On the one hand, makes them very cautious about the world. On the other hand, however, has given them, I think, some impetus now to really go out in the world and remake their relationship. So perhaps the enthusiasm and dynamism that we see in 17th century Europe is what we're seeing now in China, that the Chinese themselves are now embracing the world. They are traveling, they are learning foreign languages, they are learning new ideas, they're trying to think of ways to bring their own traditions into conversation with traditions around the world. It's a very dynamic time for young Chinese. It's a very exciting time to be alive in China. And we're only seeing a bit of this, I think, in the outside. We maybe standing in North America, we're seeing China opening up, and we see it through trade. And trade is one part of the story. But for the Chinese, it's a very exciting time for them. They are discovering the world. And perhaps in some way the story I'm telling in Vermeer's Hat is the experience that they are now having as the terms of their place in the world is now changing.
My guest today has been Timothy Brook, author of Vermeer's Hat, The 17th Century and the Dawn of the Global World. Tim, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.